The pounding on Yates Xander's door came at the worst possible time. Just as lightning split the Montana sky and thunder shook the cabin walls hard enough to rattle his coffee cup against the wooden table. He had been enjoying a rare evening of peace on his small ranch outside Columbia, Montana, watching the storm roll across the plains through his window, when the desperate knocking began. The sound was frantic, irregular, the kind that spoke of real fear rather than simple urgency. Yates pushed back from the table and crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand instinctively checking the pistol at his hip before he lifted the heavy wooden latch. The woman who nearly fell through his doorway was soaked through to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her pale face, her lips tinged blue from cold. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, and her dress, though mudded and torn at the hem, had once been fine quality. She looked up at him with wide green eyes that held equal parts desperation and determination. "Please," she gasped, water streaming down her face. "Please, I need shelter, just for tonight. I can pay you, I have money, I just need somewhere safe to stay." Yates didn't hesitate. Whatever this woman's story was, no decent man would leave anyone out in a storm like this. "Get inside," he said, stepping back to let her enter. She stumbled over the threshold and he caught her elbow to steady her. She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. "Thank you," she breathed, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "Thank you so much." He closed the door against the howling wind and studied her more carefully in the lamplight. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 21 at most, with delicate features and hands that clearly weren't used to hard labor. Her dress, despite its current state, was silk, and there were still traces of careful stitching along the bodice. This was a woman who had known wealth, or at least comfort. "You're freezing," Yates said, his voice gruff. At 28, he'd spent the last 6 years working this land alone, and he wasn't used to company, especially not beautiful women showing up on his doorstep. "I'll get you something dry to wear and build up the fire." "I don't want to be a burden," she started, but another violent shiver cut off her words. "You'll be a burden if you catch pneumonia, and I have to ride into town for the doctor in this weather," he replied, already moving toward his bedroom. "Wait here." He returned with one of his clean shirts and a pair of trousers that would be far too large for her but would at least be dry. He also grabbed a thick wool blanket from his bed. "You can change behind that screen there," he said, nodding toward the corner where he'd set up a small privacy screen when his sister had visited last year. "I'll turn around." She took the clothes with trembling hands. "You're very kind." "Just practical," he said, turning his back and moving to the fireplace to stoke the flames higher. He heard the rustle of wet fabric being peeled away, the soft gasp as she struggled with buttons or laces, and he kept his eyes firmly fixed on the fire. It had been a long time since he'd been around a woman, and he wasn't about to make her feel unsafe after she'd come to him for help. "You can turn around now," she said quietly after a few minutes. He did, and despite the absurdity of the situation, he had to suppress a smile. His shirt hung nearly to her knees, and she'd had to roll the trouser legs up several times. She'd wrapped the blanket around her shoulders like a shawl, and with her wet hair pushed back from her face, she looked impossibly young and vulnerable. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, moving closer to the fire. "Much better, thank you, Mr. Xander, Yates Xander. Most folks just call me Yates." "I'm Miriam," she said, then hesitated. "Miriam Foster." He noticed the pause before her last name but didn't comment on it. If she was running from something, that was her business. He moved to the stove and poured coffee from the pot he always kept warm. "Here, it'll help warm you up from the inside." She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping both hands around it. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this." I was traveling from Billings, and the stagecoach had trouble with a wheel. The driver said we'd have to wait until morning to get it fixed, but the town we stopped in. She trailed off, her expression darkening. There were some men there who made it clear I wouldn't be safe staying at the boarding house. So I took one of the horses and rode out, hoping to find somewhere safer to wait out the storm. Yates felt anger kindle in his chest at the implications of her words. He'd seen enough of the rougher elements that pass through Montana territory to know exactly what kind of men she was talking about. Which town? I don't remember the name. It was small, just a few buildings really. About 10 miles east of here, I think, though I'm not sure. I got turned around in the storm. Probably Hartwell's Junction, Yates said grimly. There's a saloon there that attracts a bad crowd. You were right to leave. He studied her face, noting the exhaustion beneath the fear. Have you eaten? She shook her head. Not since this morning. He moved to the cupboard and pulled out bread, cheese, and some dried beef. It wasn't fancy, but it was food. As he set it on the table, he gestured for her to sit. It's not much, but it'll fill your stomach. Miriam sat and ate with the careful, measured bites of someone who'd been taught proper manners, even though he could tell she was ravenous. She finished about half of what he'd given her before setting down her fork. I really can pay you for your hospitality. I have money. Keep your money, Yates said, refilling her coffee cup. You can sleep in my bed tonight. I'll take the floor by the fire. No, I couldn't possibly. I insist. The bed's more comfortable and you need proper rest. Besides, I've slept in worse places than a warm floor. He said it with such finality that she didn't argue further. The wind howled around the cabin for the next hour as they sat in somewhat awkward silence. Yates wasn't much for conversation at the best of times, and Miriam seemed lost in her own thoughts. Finally, when her eyelids started to droop, he stood and gestured toward the bedroom door. Go on and get some sleep. You're safe here, I promise. She looked up at him with those striking green eyes, and for a moment, something passed between them, a recognition or understanding he couldn't quite name. Thank you, Yates, truly. After she'd closed the bedroom door behind her, Yates spread out his bedroll near the fire and lay down, his mind churning. He told himself it was just Christian charity, helping someone in need, but he couldn't deny that there was something about Miriam Foster that had gotten under his skin. The way she'd looked at him, grateful but guarded. The delicate line of her jaw, the strength in her voice even when she was clearly terrified. He forced himself to close his eyes. She'd be gone in the morning, headed back to Billings or wherever end she'd really been going, and his life would return to its quiet routine of cattle, horses, and solitude. That was fine with him. It had to be. But sleep was a long time coming. Yates woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment, he was disoriented, forgetting where he was and why his bed felt so hard. Then memory returned, and he sat up quickly, looking toward the kitchen area of the cabin. Miriam was at his stove, her hair mostly dry now and falling in dark waves down her back. She'd kept on his shirt and the rolled-up trousers, and she moved around his kitchen with surprising competence, as if she'd cooked in an unfamiliar space before. You didn't have to do that, he said, standing and rolling up his bedding. She turned, a slight smile on her face. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it transformed her entirely. I wanted to. It's the least I can do after you took me in. Besides, I'm an early riser and I was getting hungry. He moved to the window and looked out. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear morning sky and ground that steamed slightly in the early sunlight. Weather's cleared. I can ride you into Columbia later if you'd like. It's only about 5 miles west. Her smile faded slightly. I suppose I should get moving. Though I have to admit, I don't know exactly where I'm going from here. Yates washed his face in the basin by the door and ran a hand through his hair, which he knew was probably sticking up at odd angles. "Thought you were headed somewhere specific." She dished out eggs and bacon onto 2 tin plates, avoiding his eyes. "I was, or I thought I was. But the truth is, I left Billings in a hurry and I didn't have much of a plan beyond getting away. Running from something." He asked it directly because in his experience, dancing around the truth just wasted everyone's time. Miriam set the plates on the table and sat down. For a long moment, she stared at her food. Then she looked up at him, her expression resigned. "Someone, actually. My father arranged for me to marry a man named Douglas Pemberton. He's 53 years old, owns half the businesses in Billings, and he's already buried 2 wives. I met him once, and he looked at me like I was a horse he was considering purchasing. So 2 days ago, I took what money I had saved, bought a stagecoach ticket, and left." Yates sat down across from her, studying her face. There was no deception there, just weary honesty. "Your father must be looking for you. Probably. But he's more concerned with the business connections the marriage would bring than he is with what I want. My mother died 3 years ago, and since then, it's been very clear that I'm just another asset to him." She picked up her fork, then set it down again. "I don't expect you to understand. You're free to live your life as you choose." "Free isn't quite the word I'd use," Yates said dryly. "But I understand wanting to make your own choices. What were you planning to do once you got wherever you were going?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I thought maybe I could find work as a teacher or a seamstress. I can read and write, and I'm good with a needle. But honestly, I hadn't thought much beyond just getting away." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Yates found himself considering possibilities he had no business considering. He had a small ranch that needed work, cattle that needed tending, and a life that was deliberately solitary. Taking in a runaway woman who was probably being hunted by her wealthy father and disappointed fiancé was the definition of trouble. But when he looked at her, saw the determined set of her shoulders despite the fear in her eyes, he remembered being 21 himself, desperate to escape the life his own father had planned for him back in Ohio. That was 7 years ago, and he'd never regretted the decision to head west and make his own way. "How old are you?" he asked suddenly. 21. "I turned 21 last month, which is why Father was so eager to finalize the marriage arrangements. He doesn't legally need my permission anymore, but he knows I could make things difficult if I chose to." So she was 7 years younger than him. Young, but not a child, old enough to know her own mind and make her own choices. "I have a proposition," he heard himself say, surprising himself as much as her. "I need help around here. The ranch is small, just about 50 head of cattle and some horses, but it's more work than one person can handle alone. I can't pay much, but I can offer room and board, and it would give you time to figure out your next move without having to rush into something." Miriam stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "You're offering me work. Here, if you want it. I won't lie to you, it's hard work. But you'd be safe, and you'd have time to decide what you really want to do." He paused, suddenly aware of how the offer might sound. "Separate sleeping arrangements, of course. I've got a small room off the back of the house I use for storage. It wouldn't take much to clear it out and make it livable." "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." "Because someone helped me once when I needed it," Yates said simply. "And because no one should be forced into a marriage they don't want. Besides," he added more practically, "I really could use the help. Shearing season is coming up and I've been dreading trying to handle it alone." She looked around the cabin, then back at him, and he could see her turning the offer over in her mind. What would people in town say? A young woman living out here with an unmarried man. Probably plenty, he admitted. But Columbia's not a big town and most folks mind their own business. We could tell anyone who asks that you're a distant cousin who came out to keep house for me. It wouldn't be the strangest arrangement anyone's ever heard of. A distant cousin, she repeated, testing the words. Or we could just tell them the truth minus the part about you running away. You needed work, I needed help. Simple as that. Miriam stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rolling grassland that surrounded his small cabin. He let her think, finishing his breakfast and trying not to hope too hard that she'd accept. It really would make sense to have help around the place, he told himself. That was all this was about. When she turned back to him, there was resolve in her expression. I'll accept on one condition. I won't take charity. Whatever work you need done, I'll do it. I'll earn my keep. Deal, Yates said, standing and extending his hand. She crossed the room and shook it, her grip firm despite her small hand. Then I suppose I'm your new hired help, Cousin Yates. He felt a smile tug at his lips despite himself. Guess you are, Cousin Miriam. Over the next few days, Yates began to understand just how little Miriam actually knew about ranch life. She'd been raised in town by wealthy parents. Her education focused on things like music, literature, and the social graces that would make her an appropriate wife for some successful businessman. She could play piano, recite poetry in 3 languages, and arrange flowers beautifully, but she'd never saddled a horse, milked a cow, or mended a fence. But what she lacked in experience, she made up for in determination. When he showed her how to collect eggs from the chicken coop, she did it without complaint even though the hens pecked at her hands. When he taught her to curry the horses, she kept at it until her arms ached. And when he demonstrated how to mend the worn fence posts that needed replacing, she paid careful attention and asked intelligent questions. The small storage room he'd mentioned was indeed small, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a chest of drawers, but Miriam had been grateful for it. Together they'd cleaned it out, whitewashed the walls, and hung a curtain across the small window for privacy. She'd accepted his offer of an extra quilt and pillow, and though she never complained, he sometimes saw her rubbing her shoulders or stretching her back in ways that told him just how much the physical labor was taking out of her. They developed a routine. Yates would wake first, start the fire and the coffee, then head out to see to the horses and cattle. Miriam would rise soon after, make breakfast, and then join him for whatever work the day required. In the evenings, they'd eat dinner together and talk, carefully at first, then more easily as they became accustomed to each other's company. He learned that her mother had died of influenza, that she'd been an only child, that her father had never recovered from his wife's death, and had instead thrown himself into his business dealings with single-minded intensity. She learned that he'd left Ohio after his father had tried to force him into taking over the family's dry goods store, that he'd worked on cattle drives, and as a ranch hand, before saving enough to buy this small piece of land 2 years ago, that he'd always preferred the company of animals to most people. It was on the 5th evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, that she asked the question he'd been half expecting. "You think my father is looking for me?" Yates considered his answer carefully. "Probably. A man like that doesn't like losing control of anything he considers his." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he'll find me? Columbia's not exactly on the main routes. Unless he has reason to think you came this direction specifically, it's a big territory to search. But I won't lie to you, Miriam. If he's determined enough and has money to hire men to look, eventually someone might come asking questions. What will you do if they come here?" He looked at her, saw the worry in her eyes, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. Depends on who they are and what they're asking. But no one's going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. I promise you that. Even if it causes trouble for you, even then. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and he felt his heart do something strange in his chest. In just 5 days, she'd somehow become more than just a woman he'd taken in out of the storm. She was becoming a friend, a partner in the daily work of keeping the ranch running. And if he was honest with himself, she was becoming something more than that too, though he tried hard not to let his mind go down that path. Miriam Foster was 21 years old, educated, cultured, and beautiful. She came from wealth and privilege, even if she'd run from it. She deserved more than a struggling rancher with a small spread and calloused hands. Once she figured out what she really wanted from life, she'd move on, probably to some city where she could use her education and live the kind of life she was meant for. He needed to remember that. But when she reached over and squeezed his hand briefly before standing to go inside, he found himself hoping, just a little, that maybe she'd decide to stay. A week turned into 2, and 2 weeks turned into a month. Spring deepened into early summer, and the work on the ranch intensified. Yates taught Miriam to ride properly, starting with his gentlest mare, a sweet-tempered bay named Rosie. She fell off twice before she got the hang of it, both times scrambling back up with a determination that made him bite back a laugh. "Don't you dare laugh at me, Yates Xander," she'd said the second time, dirt on her face and her hair coming loose from its pins. "Wouldn't dream of it," he'd replied, though his eyes were definitely smiling. By the end of the month, she could ride well enough to help him check the fence lines and move cattle from one pasture to another. She still wasn't comfortable galloping, but she could handle everything else competently enough. She also proved to have a surprising talent for dealing with the cattle. Where Yates sometimes had to push and shout to get the stubborn animals moving, Miriam seemed to have a calmer approach that often worked better. "They're just scared," she explained one day after patiently coaxing a recalcitrant heifer out of a muddy creek bed. "If you give them time to figure out what you want and make them feel safe, they'll usually cooperate." "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, impressed. She shrugged, patting the heifer's flank as it trotted past. "I didn't. It just seems like common sense. Wouldn't you rather be guided than driven?" He thought about that as they rode back to the cabin. She was right, of course. It was a philosophy that applied to more than just cattle. He wondered if she realized she was talking about her own situation too, running from a father who tried to drive her rather than guide her. They made their first trip into Columbia together on a bright Saturday morning in June. Yates needed supplies, nails and wire for fence repair, flour and sugar and coffee, ammunition, and a new bridle for one of the horses. Miriam had been reluctant at first, worried about being seen, but he'd convinced her that staying hidden would only make people more curious. "Better to be boring and ordinary," he'd said. "Just my cousin from back east who's staying to help out. Nothing interesting about that." Columbia, Montana was a small town, established just 3 years earlier in 1869 when the railroad had come through. It consisted of a main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, a doctor's office, a church, and 2 saloons. There was a bank, a land office, and a handful of houses scattered around the outskirts. Everyone knew everyone else's business, which could be either good or bad depending on your perspective. They tied their horses outside the general store, and Yates felt Miriam tense beside him as several townspeople turned to look. He kept his expression neutral and nodded to the folks he recognized. "Morning, Yates," called out Ben Harris, the blacksmith. "Who's your friend?" "This is my cousin Miriam, up from Denver to help me with the ranch," Yates said easily, amazed at how naturally the lie came. "Miriam, this is Ben Harris, best blacksmith in 3 counties. Miriam smiled politely. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Harris." "Pleasure's mine, miss." Didn't know Yates had any family. He's always been so close-mouthed about his past. "Distant cousin," Yates clarified, "but family nonetheless." Inside the store, they were greeted by Margaret Chen, whose parents had come from China to work on the railroad and had stayed to open the general store. She was about 40, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, but fair in her dealings. "Yates Xander, as I live and breathe. I was starting to think you died out there on that ranch of yours. It's been near 6 weeks since you came to town." Her eyes shifted to Miriam with open curiosity. "And who might this be?" Yates introduced Miriam again with the same story, and he could see Margaret taking in every detail of Miriam's appearance, from her borrowed work dress to her sun-touched face. Miriam bore the scrutiny with grace, smiling and asking polite questions about the store and the town. "Well," Margaret said finally, apparently satisfied with whatever she'd seen, "it's good you have help out there. That place is too much for one person. I'm glad to meet you, Miss Foster." They spent an hour in the store, selecting supplies while Margaret chatted about town gossip. The minister's wife was expecting again, the third child. There'd been some rustling problems south of town, so folks were keeping a closer watch on their herds. The railroad was talking about extending the line further west, which might bring more business to Columbia. As Yates was loading their purchases onto the wagon he'd brought, Sheriff Thomas Webb ambled over. He was in his mid-50s, a large man with a gray beard and eyes that missed very little. "Yates," he said by way of greeting, "heard you had a visitor staying with you." "My cousin Miriam," Yates said, keeping his voice level. "She's helping me run the ranch." "That right?" Webb's eyes moved to where Miriam was securing a bag of flour. "Pretty young woman to be living way out there alone with you." Yates felt his jaw tighten. "She's family and she's not alone. I'm there." Sure, just saying folks might talk is all." Webb's tone was friendly enough, but there was a note of warning in it. Might be wise to consider propriety. Before Yates could respond, Miriam walked over. "Sheriff Webb, I presume? Yates has told me about you. I want to thank you for keeping this town safe. I've been in places where the law wasn't so vigilant and it made all the difference." Webb's expression softened slightly at her words. "Just doing my job, miss. Welcome to Columbia." After the sheriff moved on, Miriam looked at Yates with raised eyebrows. "He was warning us, wasn't he, about appearances?" "Something like that. Small town thinking. You all right with that?" She smiled wryly. "I ran away from Billings to avoid being forced into marriage with a man I didn't choose. I think I can handle some gossip about living arrangements." They finished their shopping and headed back to the ranch. As they rode, Yates found himself watching Miriam from the corner of his eye. She sat straight in the wagon seat, her face turned toward the sun, looking more relaxed than she had since that first night. Something about the way she looked, confident and at peace despite the sheriff's warnings, made his heart tighten. He was falling for her. He'd been trying to deny it for weeks, telling himself she was just someone he was helping, that these feelings were just natural reactions to having a woman around after so long alone. But watching her now, seeing how she'd handled the townspeople with grace and the sheriff with quiet dignity, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. He was falling in love with Miriam Foster, and it was probably the stupidest thing he'd ever done. That evening, as they unloaded the supplies and put everything away, Miriam was unusually quiet. Yates noticed but didn't push, figuring she'd talk when she was ready. They made dinner together, a companionable routine they'd developed over the past month, and ate on the porch as the sun set. Finally, as the first stars began to appear, she spoke. "Do you think I should leave?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "What? Why would you ask that?" the sheriff's warning. "People talking. I don't want to cause problems for you, Yates. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I'd hate for your reputation to suffer because of me." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Miriam, my reputation was never all that sterling to begin with. I'm a loner who chose to homestead in the middle of nowhere. If people want to talk, they'll talk regardless of what we do. The question is, do you want to leave?" "No," she said immediately, then looked surprised at her own vehemence. "No, I don't. I've been happier this past month than I have in years. I love the work, even when it's hard. I love waking up and knowing exactly what needs to be done. I love the horses and the cattle and even the stupid chickens that peck at me. I love—" She trailed off, seeming to catch herself. "You love what?" he prompted gently. She looked at him, and in the fading light her eyes were luminous. "I love being here, with you. This feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived." Yates felt his heart hammering in his chest. He knew he should be careful, should keep things professional and distant, but he was tired of being careful. He reached over and took her hand, her fingers small and calloused now from work. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay as long as you want. I don't give a damn what anyone in town thinks." She squeezed his hand, and they sat like that until full darkness fell, neither of them speaking, neither of them needing to. The rhythm of their days continued through June and into July. The work was demanding but satisfying. They repaired fences, treated a sick calf back to health, broke a young gelding to saddle, and harvested the small vegetable garden Miriam had insisted on planting. Through it all, something was changing between them, subtle but undeniable. Yates found himself looking forward to the evenings most of all, when the day's work was done and they could sit together and talk. Miriam was smart and well-read, and she challenged his opinions in ways that made him think. She'd ask him about his life before Montana, and he found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone. About his overbearing father who'd seen Yates's dreams of independence as betrayal. About his mother, who died when he was 15 and had always encouraged him to follow his own path. About the years of hard work and saving that had finally allowed him to buy this land. In turn, she told him more about her own life. How lonely she'd been after her mother died. How her father had become a stranger, more interested in business mergers than his daughter's happiness. How she'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher, but her father had dismissed it as inappropriate for a woman of her station. How terrified she'd been the night she'd run, not knowing if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the bravest choice. "It was brave," Yates told her one evening. "Not many people have the courage to walk away from security, even when it's strangling them." "I had no idea what I was walking toward," she admitted. "I could have ended up anywhere in any situation. It was pure luck that I found you." "I don't know about luck," he said, smiling. "You nearly died of cold on my doorstep." She laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common and that he treasured. "True. But I did find you, and you turned out to be kind and decent and willing to give a desperate stranger a chance. That's more than luck. That's a miracle." Their hands had been gravitating toward each other more and more during these evening talks. Sometimes he'd help her down from the wagon, and his hands would linger on her waist a moment too long. Sometimes she'd pass him something at dinner, and their fingers would brush. It was never overt, never discussed, but it was there, a current running between them that grew stronger every day. Then came the evening in mid-July when everything changed. They'd spent the day moving cattle to a new pasture, hot, dusty work under the relentless Montana sun. When they finally returned to the cabin, both were exhausted and filthy. Yates had hauled water from the well for them to wash, and Miriam had gone to her room to clean up and change. He was at the stove, starting dinner when she emerged. She'd put on the one nice dress she owned, a simple blue cotton that matched her eyes. Her hair was down, falling in dark waves around her shoulders, still slightly damp. She looked young and beautiful and so far out of his league it hurt. "You didn't have to dress up," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "I wanted to," she said simply. "Yates, we need to talk." Those 4 words sent ice through his veins. "All right." She came closer, standing on the other side of the kitchen table. "I've been here almost 2 months now. In another few weeks, it'll be harvest time, and after that you'll be preparing for winter. I need to know what your expectations are. Am I still just temporary help? Someone passing through until I figure out my next move? Or is there something more here?" He stared at her, his heart pounding. "What do you want there to be? That's not fair. I asked you first." But her voice was gentle, and she was looking at him with an expression that gave him courage. The truth. He set down the spoon he'd been holding and moved around the table until he was standing in front of her. "The truth is, I don't want you to be temporary. I want you to stay. Not as hired help or a cousin or any other damn excuse we've been using. I want you to stay because you want to be here with me. Because these past 2 months have been the best of my life, and the thought of you leaving makes me feel like someone's kicked me in the chest." Her eyes had gone wide, and he couldn't read her expression. He pressed on, figuring he might as well say it all. "I know I'm not what you deserve. I'm just a rancher with a small spread and rough hands and no education to speak of. You could have so much more than this, so much more than me. But Miriam, I'm falling in love with you, and I had to tell you that before you make any decisions about leaving." For a long moment she just looked at him. Then slowly a smile spread across her face, radiant and joyful. "You're falling in love with me?" "Yes," he said helplessly. "I know it's probably not what you want to hear." "Not what I want to hear," she laughed, and before he knew what was happening, she'd closed the distance between them and thrown her arms around his neck. "Yates Xander, I've been in love with you for weeks. I was terrified you just saw me as an obligation or at best a friend." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You love me." "I love you," she confirmed, her eyes shining. "I love your kindness and your quiet strength. I love how patient you've been teaching me about ranch work. I love watching you with the animals, so gentle despite your size. I love our evening talks and the way you actually listen to my opinions. I love the life we've built here together. I love you." Yates cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Can I kiss you, please?" she breathed. He kissed her gently at first, almost reverently, hardly believing this was real. She made a small sound in her throat and pressed closer, her fingers threading through his hair. The kiss deepened, and Yates felt like his heart might burst from his chest. He'd kissed women before, but never like this. Never with this feeling of rightness of coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Miriam looked up at him with flushed cheeks and swollen lips, more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. "Well," she said, a little breathlessly. "That was worth waiting for," he laughed, pure joy bubbling up in his chest. "Miriam Foster, will you stay? Not as my employee or my cousin, but as the woman I love. Will you build a life here with me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They stood there holding each other as the dinner on the stove began to burn, neither of them caring. Outside, the sun set in a blaze of glory, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The world continued on, but for Yates and Miriam, this moment was everything. Of course, love alone didn't solve all their problems. Over the next few weeks, as their relationship shifted from cautious friendship to acknowledged romance, they had to figure out what this meant practically. Miriam still slept in her small room, and Yates still slept in his, though they both acknowledged that wouldn't always be the case. They knew they needed to get married, both for propriety's sake and because neither of them wanted to wait forever to truly be together. But marriage brought its own complications. To get legally married, they'd need to go to the county seat, which was Deer Lodge, a full day's ride from Columbia. They'd need a marriage license, which required providing information about their families and backgrounds, and that raised the question of whether Miriam's father might be looking for marriage records as a way to track her down. "We could wait," Yates suggested one evening as they discussed it. "Give it more time, make sure your father's given up looking." But Miriam shook her head. "I don't want to wait. I want to be your wife properly and legally. If my father finds me, then we'll deal with it together. But I'm not going to live my life in fear of him." Her courage humbled him. "All right then. We'll make a trip to Deer Lodge next week. Get everything official." They told Margaret Chen their plans the next time they were in Columbia, knowing that she'd spread the word more effectively than any formal announcement. To Yates's surprise, Margaret seemed genuinely pleased. "About time," she said, beaming at them both. "Anyone with eyes could see how you two felt about each other. When's the wedding?" "We're going to Deer Lodge next week for the license," Miriam explained. "Then we thought we'd ask the minister here to perform a ceremony. Reverend Michaels will be happy to do it, I'm sure, and we'll need to have a proper celebration. Don't you dare try to sneak off and get married without letting the town throw you a party." Yates had to smile at that. He'd lived on the outskirts of Columbia for 2 years, always keeping himself separate, and now suddenly the town wanted to celebrate his marriage. It was strange but also warming in a way he hadn't expected. Word spread quickly, and over the next few days, several townspeople stopped by the ranch with congratulations and small gifts. Ben Harris brought a set of horseshoes he'd forged himself. The minister's wife brought preserves and a beautiful quilt. Even Sheriff Webb came by, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Foster," he said, after Yates had invited him in for coffee. "Or should I say, soon to be Mrs. Xander, I want to apologize if I was harsh when we first met. I see now that you and Yates have something real here." "Thank you, Sheriff," Miriam said graciously. "I appreciate that." After Webb left, Miriam turned to Yates with a question in her eyes. "Do you think he suspects anything about my background? Maybe. Webb's a smart man. But if he does, I don't think he cares as long as you're not running from the law." "Just from a forced marriage and an overbearing father," she said with a wry smile. The trip to Deer Lodge went smoothly. They made the journey in one long day, stayed overnight at a small hotel, and went to the county office first thing the next morning. The clerk was a bored-looking man in his 40s who barely glanced at them as he took down their information. Names: Yates Xander and Miriam Foster. Ages: 28 and 21. Previous marriages: none. Parents' names. The clerk looked up for this one, pen poised. Yates gave his parents' names easily. Miriam hesitated for just a second before providing hers. If her father did somehow see these records, so be it. She wasn't going to start her marriage with a lie. They paid the fee, received their license, and walked out into the summer sunshine as officially engaged to be married. Yates felt lighter than he had in weeks. Miriam slipped her hand into his as they walked back to where they'd left their horses. "One step closer," she said, smiling up at him. "One step closer," he agreed. They rode back to Columbia the next day, and the following Sunday, Reverend Michaels married them in the small church with most of the town in attendance. Miriam wore a dress that Margaret Chen had altered for her, pale yellow cotton with lace at the collar. Yates wore his best shirt and the new vest Ben Harris's wife had made for him. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed Miriam in front of God and everyone, not caring who saw. The town did indeed throw them a party. Tables were set up in front of the church with food that seemed to appear from nowhere. Someone brought a fiddle, and there was music and dancing. Yates, who normally hated being the center of attention, found himself actually enjoying it. Miriam glowed beside him, laughing and talking with the townspeople who'd accepted her as one of their own. As the sun began to set and people started to drift home, Margaret Chen pulled them both aside. "You two have something special," she said, her normally sharp expression softening. "Hold on to it. Life out here is hard enough without going through it alone." "We will," Miriam promised, squeezing Yates's hand. They rode back to the ranch in the twilight, both quiet but content. When they arrived home, Yates helped Miriam down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist. "Mrs. Xander," he said, testing out the name. She smiled. "Mr. Xander." "I like the sound of that." He picked her up, making her laugh in surprise, and carried her over the threshold of their home. Inside, he set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Miriam. I'm going to spend every day trying to make you happy." "You already make me happy," she said, reaching up to kiss him. "Just by being you." That night, as they came together as husband and wife in the bed they would now share, Yates thought back to the storm-soaked woman who'd knocked on his door less than 3 months ago. He'd had no idea then that he was opening his door to his future, his partner, his everything. But now, holding Miriam in his arms as she slept peacefully against his chest, he couldn't imagine his life any other way. The peace lasted through the rest of July and into August. They worked the ranch together, now truly as partners. The cattle were healthy, the horses were strong, and the small garden Miriam tended provided fresh vegetables for their table. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset, talking about their plans for the future. Maybe they'd expand the herd next year. Maybe they'd add on to the cabin, create a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. Maybe, someday, there would be children running around the property. It was a good life, simple but fulfilling, and they were happy. Then, on a hot afternoon in late August, 2 men rode up to the ranch. Yates saw them coming from where he was working on the corral fence and felt his stomach tighten. They were strangers, well dressed in a way that marked them as city men, and they rode expensive horses. He set down his hammer and walked toward them, intercepting them before they could reach the house where Miriam was inside making lunch. "Help you gentlemen?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. The older of the 2 men, probably in his 50s with gray at his temples, looked down at him with an expression of disdain. "I'm looking for my daughter, Miriam Foster. I have reason to believe she might be here." Yates felt his blood run cold but kept his expression blank. "Who might you be?" "Marcus Foster from Billings. This is my associate, Mr. Pemberton. Now, is my daughter here or not?" So this was Miriam's father and the man she'd been running from. Yates took in Pemberton's appearance, older than he'd imagined, with cold eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. The thought of Miriam married to this man made him feel sick. "There's no one named Miriam Foster here," Yates said carefully, technically telling the truth. "Her legal name was Xander now. Don't play games with me, boy," Foster snapped. "I traced the stage coach she took, found the town where she stole a horse. People in Columbia said a young woman matching her description has been living out here with you." Before Yates could respond, the cabin door opened and Miriam stepped out. She froze when she saw the 2 men, and Yates saw all the color drain from her face. Then, slowly, she lifted her chin and walked toward them. "Hello, Father, Mr. Pemberton." Marcus Foster dismounted, his expression thunderous. "Miriam, you have any idea what you've put me through? Running off like a child, making me look like a fool in front of my business associates. Get your things. We're going back to Billings immediately." "No," Miriam said quietly but firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. You're my daughter and you'll do as you're told. This foolishness has gone on long enough. Mr. Pemberton has been generous enough to wait for your return, but his patience has limits. You're going to marry him as agreed, and that's the end of it." "I can't marry Mr. Pemberton," Miriam said. "I'm already married." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Foster stared at his daughter as if she'd spoken in tongues. "What did you say?" "I'm married." "To Yates Xander. We were married 3 weeks ago in Columbia. It's legal and registered with the county." Foster's face went from red to purple. "You married this nobody. This rancher with a pathetic little spread in the middle of nowhere. Have you lost your mind?" "Watch how you talk about my wife," Yates said, his voice low and dangerous. He moved to stand beside Miriam, taking her hand. Pemberton spoke for the first time, his voice cold. "This marriage is obviously invalid. The girl was clearly coerced or deceived. We can have it annulled." "The hell you will," Yates said. "Miriam married me of her own free will in front of witnesses and a man of God. There's no coercion, no deception. She's my wife and she's staying here." "I could have you arrested for kidnapping," Foster threatened, "for harboring a runaway." "I'm 21 years old," Miriam said, her voice stronger now. "I'm not a runaway child. I'm a grown woman who made her own choice, and I choose to be here with my husband." "I'll cut you off," Foster said, his voice shaking with rage. "Not a penny of my money will ever come to you. You'll be poor and struggling out here in this God-forsaken wilderness." "I don't want your money," Miriam replied. "I want to live my life on my own terms with the man I love." "That's worth more than any amount of money." Pemberton's expression had gone ugly. "You little fool. You think love is going to keep you warm when winter comes. You think it's going to feed you when the crops fail. You're a stupid child playing at being a pioneer." Yates took a step forward, and something in his expression made Pemberton take a step back. "You need to leave, now, before I do something I might regret." "This isn't over," Foster said, but he was already remounting his horse. "You've made a terrible mistake, Miriam. When you come crawling back, begging for help, don't expect any sympathy from me." "I won't be crawling back," Miriam said. "Goodbye, Father." They watched the two men ride away, neither speaking until they were out of sight. Then Miriam sagged against Yates, and he felt her trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I brought this to your door." "Hey," he said gently, turning her to face him. "You didn't bring anything except yourself, and that's all I wanted. Are you all right?" She nodded, then shook her head, then started to cry. Yates held her close, letting her sob into his chest, his heart breaking for her. Whatever complicated feelings she had about her father, that had to have been painful. "He's right, you know," she said when she could speak again. "I did make your life harder. You could have been left in peace." "I don't want peace if it means not having you," Yates said fiercely. "Do you understand that? I'd rather face 100 angry fathers and rejected suitors than spend one day without you." She looked up at him, tears still streaming down her face. "Really, really. Miriam, you're not just my wife. You're my partner, my best friend, the person I want to see every morning and hold every night. Whatever challenges we face them together. That's what marriage means." She kissed him then, salty with tears but full of love. When they broke apart, she managed a watery smile. "Together. Together," he confirmed. Over the next few weeks, they heard nothing more from Marcus Foster or Douglas Pemberton. Sheriff Webb stopped by once to make sure everything was all right, having heard about the confrontation from someone who'd seen the two strangers riding through town. Yates and Miriam assured him they were fine, and Webb seemed satisfied. "For what it's worth," he said before leaving, "I think you two are good for each other. Anyone can see how happy you are." As summer faded into fall, they prepared for winter. They stocked the root cellar with vegetables from the garden. They cut and stacked firewood until Yates's back ached. They moved the cattle to the pasture closest to the barn where they could be more easily tended during snow. Through it all, they worked side by side, their partnership deepening with each passing day. In October, Miriam realized she was pregnant. She told Yates one evening as they were getting ready for bed. He'd been telling her about his plans for expanding the cattle herd in the spring when she'd interrupted him. "Yates, I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made him pause. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. At least I don't think so. I hope not." She took a deep breath. "I'm going to have a baby." He stared at her for a long moment, processing the words. Then a huge grin spread across his face. "Really? You're sure? As sure as I can be." "I've missed my monthly courses twice now, and I've been feeling sick in the mornings. Margaret Chen says those are the signs." "You told Margaret before you told me?" he asked, but there was no heat in it. "I wanted to be certain before I got your hopes up. Yates, are you happy about this?" Instead of answering, he picked her up and spun her around, making her laugh. "Happy? Miriam, I'm ecstatic. We're going to have a baby. A family." He set her down gently, suddenly worried. "Are you all right? Should you be doing heavy work? Do you need to rest?" She laughed at his concern. "I'm fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm not made of glass, but yes, I'll be careful. And you'll have to take on some of the heavier tasks as I get further along." "Whatever you need," he promised. "Anything at all." That winter was harsh, as Montana winters often were. The snow came early and stayed late, and there were days when the wind howled so fiercely they couldn't leave the cabin. But inside, they were warm and safe. Yates doted on Miriam as her pregnancy progressed, bringing her tea when she felt sick, rubbing her feet when they swelled, reading to her in the evenings from the small collection of books they'd accumulated. In December, Margaret Chen and the minister's wife came out to visit, bringing supplies and advice for the expectant mother. They helped Miriam prepare baby clothes, showed her how to fashion diapers from old cloth, and told her stories about their own pregnancies and births. Yates listened from across the cabin, pretending to be focused on mending a bridle but actually absorbing every word. The thought of Miriam going through childbirth terrified him, but he knew better than to voice those fears. After the women left, Miriam came and sat beside him. "You're worried." It wasn't a question. "A little," he admitted. "Is that wrong?" "No, it's sweet. But Yates, women have babies every day. I'll be fine." "Your mother," he started, then stopped, not sure how to voice his fear. "My mother died of influenza, not childbirth," Miriam said gently, understanding. "I know there are risks, but I'm healthy and strong, thanks to all the ranch work you've had me doing. And Margaret said she'd come stay with us when my time gets close. We'll get through this together." "Together," he echoed, pulling her close. The baby came on a warm day in early May, almost a year after Miriam had first knocked on Yates's door. Margaret Chen had been staying with them for a week, waiting for signs that labor was beginning. When Miriam woke Yates just after dawn, her face tight with pain, he'd known it was time. The next 12 hours were the longest of his life. Margaret banished him from the bedroom after the first hour, telling him he was making Miriam more nervous with his pacing and worried looks. He spent the time in the main room of the cabin, alternating between pacing, praying, and jumping at every sound from the bedroom. When he finally heard the cry of a baby, thin and reedy but strong, he thought his heart might stop. A few minutes later, Margaret emerged, smiling broadly. "Congratulations, Yates. You have a son." A son. He had a son. He moved toward the bedroom, but Margaret stopped him. "Give me a minute to get things cleaned up, then you can see your wife and child." When she finally let him in, he found Miriam propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. She looked up as he entered, and her smile was like the sun. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Yates approached the bed as if in a dream. He looked down at the baby in Miriam's arms and felt his breath catch. The child was tiny, perfect, with a shock of dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face. As Yates watched, the baby opened his eyes briefly, revealing dark blue depths before closing them again. "Can I hold him?" Yates asked, his voice rough with emotion. Miriam carefully transferred the baby into his arms. Yates held his son with infinite care, terrified of hurting something so small and fragile. The baby stirred, made a small sound, and somehow, impossibly, Yates fell even more deeply in love. "He's perfect," Yates whispered. "Miriam, he's absolutely perfect. He is, isn't he?" She reached up to touch his face. "What should we name him?" They'd discussed names over the winter but had never settled on anything. Now, looking at his son, Yates knew exactly what felt right. "James. After your grandfather, the one you told me about, James Xander." Tears filled Miriam's eyes. "You remembered. Yes, James is perfect. He would have been so happy to know he had a great-grandson named after him." Margaret left the next day, satisfied that both mother and baby were doing well. Over the next few weeks, they settled into their new life as parents. It was exhausting, with James waking every few hours to be fed, but it was also joyful in ways Yates had never imagined. Watching Miriam with their son, seeing the tenderness in her eyes as she nursed him, made Yates's heart swell with love and gratitude. He took over more of the ranch work, letting Miriam rest and care for the baby. Neighbors stopped by with gifts and advice. Even Sheriff Webb came out, bringing a hand-carved rattle he'd made himself. The community that Yates had kept at arm's length for so long had embraced his family, and he found himself grateful for it. James grew quickly, as babies do. By the end of summer, he was smiling and gurgling, and by fall, he was trying to sit up on his own. Watching him develop, seeing pieces of both himself and Miriam in their son's features and personality, gave Yates a sense of purpose and joy he'd never known before. They celebrated James's first birthday in May of 1873, a small party with just a few close friends from town. As Yates watched his son smash cake all over his face and laugh with pure joy, he looked over at Miriam and found her watching him. She smiled, and he saw in her eyes the same contentment he felt. That evening, after James was asleep and they were sitting on the porch watching the stars come out, Miriam leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how we got here? How a thunderstorm and a desperate knock on your door led to all this?" "All the time," Yates admitted. "I think about how close I came to not answering that door. What if I'd assumed it was just the wind? What if I'd been out checking the cattle and hadn't heard you knock?" "But you did answer," she said. "And you took me in and you gave me a chance when you had no reason to. You changed my entire life, Yates. You changed mine," he countered. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions, working the ranch, but not really living. You made me want to build something bigger than myself. A home, a family, a future. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." She turned and kissed him soft and sweet. I love you too, more than I can say." The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the slow, steady growth of their family and their ranch. In 1874, Miriam gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Caroline. She had Miriam's green eyes and Yates's stubborn determination. In 1876, another son arrived whom they named Thomas. He was quiet and thoughtful, content to watch the world around him with serious dark eyes. The ranch prospered too. With careful management and hard work, they expanded their herd and added more horses. They built onto the cabin, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The small ranch that had been just enough for one man became a thriving homestead that supported a family of 5. Of Marcus Foster, they heard nothing. Whatever anger or disappointment he'd felt had apparently hardened into permanent silence. Miriam admitted to Yates that it hurt sometimes, knowing her father had chosen pride over family, but she didn't regret her choice. She had made her own family, one built on love rather than obligation. The town of Columbia grew too. The railroad brought more people, more businesses. What had been a handful of buildings in 1872 became a proper town by 1878. Through it all, Yates and Miriam remained central figures in the community. Miriam started a small school for the children of local ranchers, teaching reading and writing and arithmetic in their cabin during the winter months. Yates served on the town council, helping to make decisions about shared resources and infrastructure. On a warm evening in May of 1879, 7 years after Miriam had first knocked on his door, the family gathered on their expanded porch to celebrate James's 8th birthday. Caroline was 5 now, Thomas was 3, and Miriam was pregnant again with their 4th child. The ranch was thriving, the children were healthy, and they were surrounded by friends who'd become like family. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Yates helped get the children to bed. James was old enough now to help with small chores around the ranch, and he took his responsibilities seriously. Caroline was bright and curious, always asking questions about everything. Thomas was still young enough to need carrying sometimes, and Yates savored these moments, knowing how quickly children grew. After the children were asleep, Yates and Miriam returned to the porch. She was showing her pregnancy now, her belly round beneath her dress. He pulled her gently against his side, his hand resting protectively over where their 4th child grew. "Happy?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Incredibly happy," she confirmed. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. That I went from being terrified and desperate, running from a future I couldn't bear, to this. A husband I adore, children I love more than life itself, a home that's truly mine. It's more than I ever dreamed possible." "You know what I think about sometimes," Yates said. "That storm that brought you here. How angry I was that someone was interrupting my peaceful evening. I almost didn't answer the door. But you did. But I did. And everything changed. You knocked on my door begging for shelter, and I had no idea you'd become my everything, my whole world. The center of my life. Every good thing I have stems from that moment I chose to open the door and let you in." Miriam turned to look up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "Do you know what I thought that night? When you opened the door and I saw your face, I thought, please let this man be kind. Please let him not turn me away, and you were more than kind. You were generous and patient and good. You gave me shelter, yes, but you also gave me hope. You gave me a future I could choose instead of one that was chosen for me." He kissed her forehead, then her lips, tasting salt from her tears. "I would open that door 1,000 times over if it meant getting to live this life with you." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars came out, one by one. In the house behind them, their children slept safely. Around them, the land they'd worked together stretched out under the vast Montana sky. It was a good life, simple but rich in the ways that mattered. They had their health, their family, their love, and each other. What more could anyone want? In September of 1879, Miriam gave birth to their 4th child, another son they named Daniel. The birth was easier than the others had been, and Miriam recovered quickly. Daniel was a happy baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss. James and Caroline were old enough to help with the younger children now, and the whole family adjusted to having 4 children with surprising ease. As the children grew, they each developed their own personalities and interests. James loved working with the cattle and horses, following Yates around the ranch, and absorbing everything his father could teach him. Caroline had inherited her mother's love of learning and spent hours reading every book she could get her hands on. Thomas was fascinated by how things worked, always taking apart and trying to put back together anything mechanical he could find. Daniel, still young, was simply happy to be included in whatever his older siblings were doing. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. There were harsh winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, injuries and illnesses that had to be weathered. But through it all, Yates and Miriam faced everything together, their partnership as strong as it had been from the beginning. In 1885, when James was 14 and beginning to do the work of a man on the ranch, a stranger rode up one afternoon while Yates and James were working on the barn. The man was well-dressed but older now, his hair completely gray. It took Yates a moment to recognize him. Marcus Foster looked smaller than Yates remembered, diminished somehow. He sat his horse uncertainly, staring at the ranch house and the barn, the children playing in the yard, the clear signs of prosperity and happiness. "Mr. Foster," Yates said neutrally, "it's been a long time." 13 years, Foster said, his voice rough. "I came to see my daughter." "And my grandchildren." Yates studied the older man carefully. "Does Miriam know you're coming?" "No, I wasn't sure she'd agree to see me if I asked, so I took a chance." He dismounted, moving stiffly. "Please, I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to talk to her." Yates considered sending him away. 13 years of silence, of rejection, of choosing pride over family. But he saw something in Foster's eyes that hadn't been there before. Regret, maybe, or loneliness, and it wasn't his place to make this decision. Miriam was strong enough to choose for herself whether to see her father. "Wait here," Yates said. "I'll ask her." He found Miriam in the kitchen, working on bread dough while Caroline helped and the younger boys played on the floor. She looked up when he entered and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "What's wrong? Your father is here, outside. He wants to see you." All the color drained from her face. She gripped the edge of the table. "My father?" "Yes, I can send him away if you want." "You don't owe him anything, Miriam, not after how he treated you." She was silent for a long moment, emotions flickering across her face too quickly for him to read. Then she straightened her shoulders. "No, I'll see him, but Yates, stay close, of course." She washed the flour from her hands and smoothed her apron. Caroline watched with wide eyes. "Mama, who is that man?" "He's your grandfather," Miriam said softly. "My father. I haven't seen him in a very long time." Yates followed Miriam outside, keeping a protective hand on her back. Marcus Foster turned when he heard the door, and when he saw Miriam, his face crumpled. "Miriam," he breathed, "you look so well, so happy." "I am happy," she said, her voice steady but cool. "Why are you here, Father?" "I came to apologize," he said. "And to see if there might be any chance you could forgive a foolish old man who let his pride destroy the most important thing in his life." Miriam's expression didn't soften. 13 years. You've had 13 years to reach out, to apologize, to be part of my life. Why now?" Foster looked down at his hands. "Because I'm dying. Cancer, the doctors say. I have maybe 6 months left. And I realize that I'm going to die alone with no one to mourn me except paid employees, because I drove away everyone who ever mattered to me. Your mother would be ashamed of how I treated you, of how I chose money and pride over my own daughter's happiness." Tears were streaming down Miriam's face now, though her expression remained guarded. "Do you know what you did to me?" I spent years thinking I wasn't good enough, that I'd failed you somehow. It took a long time for me to understand that the failure was yours, not mine." "You're right," Foster said. "Completely right. You made the brave choice, the right choice. You found a good man who loves you and built a beautiful life. I was wrong about everything. And I know I have no right to ask this, but I'm asking anyway. Please, Miriam, let me know my grandchildren before I die. Let me try to make up for even a fraction of the hurt I caused you." Yates felt Miriam trembling beside him. He squeezed her hand, letting her know he supported whatever decision she made. Finally, she spoke. "I can't promise to forgive you right away. What you did hurt too much for that, but I won't turn you away. You can stay for a few days if you'd like. Meet your grandchildren. We can talk and we'll see where that leads." "Thank you," Foster said, his voice breaking. "Thank you, Miriam." Over the next few days, Marcus Foster stayed in the small guest room they'd added to the house. He was awkward with the children at first, clearly not used to being around young people, but gradually he warmed to them. James was polite but distant, protective of his mother. Caroline was curious, asking questions about her mother's childhood. The younger boys simply accepted this new grandfather with the easy adaptability of children. Yates watched carefully as Miriam and her father talked, long conversations on the porch or walking around the property. He couldn't hear what was said, but he saw the gradual thawing in Miriam's posture, the way the tension in her shoulders eased. On the evening before Foster was set to return to Billings, he asked to speak to Yates alone. They sat by the fire as the rest of the family slept. "I owe you an apology too," Foster said. "I called you a nobody, said terrible things about you and your life here. I was wrong. You've given my daughter something I never could, true happiness. Security that comes from love, not money. A family built on mutual respect and partnership. You're a better man than I ever was, Yates Xander." "I love her," Yates said simply. "That's all I ever wanted, to love her and be loved by her and build a life together." "It's everything," Foster said. "I know that now, too late, but at least I got to see it, to see how happy she is. That's more than I deserved." He paused, then continued. "I've rewritten my will. Everything I have is going to Miriam and her children. There's more money than you might think. Enough to expand this ranch significantly if you want, or to save for the children's education, or to do whatever you please. I know you don't need my money, that you've built this life yourselves, but I want to leave something behind that might help make their futures easier." Yates didn't know what to say. "That's generous, but you should discuss it with Miriam first." "I have. She said she'd accept it only if it was something I truly wanted to do, not out of guilt, and I told her the truth. I want to do it because they're my family, and I wasted years pretending they weren't. I can't get those years back, but I can do this." After Foster left, returning to Billings with promises to write and visit again if his health allowed, Miriam was quiet for several days. Finally, one evening as they were getting ready for bed, she spoke. "I'm glad he came. Not because I needed his apology or his money, but because I needed the closure. I needed to know that the wall between us wasn't my fault and that he recognized that before he died." "How do you feel about him now?" Yates asked gently. She considered the question. "Sad mostly. Sad for the years we lost, sad for the relationship we could have had. I don't think I'll ever fully forgive him, but I've let go of the anger. That's enough." Marcus Foster died 4 months later, in January of 1886. He'd managed one more visit to the ranch in December, where he'd spent Christmas with his daughter and her family. It was a peaceful visit, and when he left, Miriam hugged him goodbye. He died in his sleep 2 weeks later, his affairs in order, his peace made as well as it could be. The inheritance was indeed substantial. After much discussion, Yates and Miriam decided to put most of it aside for their children's futures, though they did use some to make improvements to the ranch. They added more land, purchased better breeding stock, and built a proper schoolhouse in Columbia, something Miriam had long dreamed of doing. The years continued their steady march forward. James grew into a capable young man who took over more and more of the ranch work. Caroline went east for a teaching degree, coming back to Columbia to take over the school her mother had started. Thomas developed a talent for working with horses that drew buyers from across Montana. Daniel, the youngest, was still finding his way but showed promise in everything he tried. In 1892, James married a local girl named Sarah, and in 1893, Yates and Miriam became grandparents for the first time when James and Sarah had a daughter. Holding his granddaughter, Yates thought about how far they'd come from that stormy night 20 years earlier, when a desperate young woman had knocked on his door. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1892, Yates had surprised Miriam with something he'd been working on for months. He led her outside as the sun was setting to a spot near the house where he'd erected a new structure. It was a gazebo, beautiful and sturdy, with a bench inside that faced west toward the sunset. "What's this?" Miriam asked, delighted. "It's for you, for us. A place to sit and watch the sunsets like we've always done, but more comfortable as we get older." He took her hand and led her to the bench, where they sat together. "20 years ago today, I made you my wife. It's still the best decision I ever made, even with all the chaos that came with it. The children, the struggles, my father, all of it. Especially with all of that," he said firmly. "Miriam, you didn't just become my wife. You became my partner in every sense of the word. We built this life together, every bit of it, the good times and the hard times. And I wouldn't change a single moment." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder just like she'd done thousands of times before. "Do you remember what you said to me? That I'd knocked on your door begging for shelter, and you had no idea I'd become your everything?" "I remember." "You became my everything too," she said softly. "My shelter, my home, my future, my love. Everything good in my life started with you opening that door and taking a chance on a desperate stranger." "Best chance I ever took," Yates said, kissing her temple. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Around them, the ranch they'd built thrived. In the house behind them, evidence of their children and now grandchildren filled every room. It was a life neither of them could have imagined when they'd first met, but one they'd built together through hard work, dedication, and above all, love. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, Miriam spoke one more time. "Thank you, Yates, for everything. For opening your door that night, for seeing past my desperation to the person I could become, for loving me when I didn't think I was worthy of love, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you for knocking," he replied. "For being brave enough to run toward an unknown future instead of accepting one that would have destroyed you. For choosing to stay when you could have left. For loving me back." The years that followed were gentler, the pace of life slowing as Yates and Miriam aged. James took over primary responsibility for the ranch, with Thomas handling the horse breeding operation. Caroline's school flourished, educating children from across the region. Daniel, after trying several different paths, found his calling in medicine and left to study to become a doctor. Grandchildren continued to arrive, each one a blessing. By 1900, Yates and Miriam had 9 grandchildren, with more on the way. The small cabin that had once housed just Yates, then Yates and Miriam, was now the center of a sprawling family compound. Additional houses had been built on the property for James and Thomas and their families. Family dinners were loud, chaotic affairs with children running everywhere and multiple conversations happening at once. Yates, now 57, moved a bit slower than he used to, but he was still strong and capable. Miriam, 50, had threads of silver in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes. They'd lived a hard life in many ways, full of physical labor and challenges, but it had been a good life. A happy life. On a warm evening in June of 1900, 28 years after Miriam had first knocked on Yates's door, the entire family gathered for a celebration. It was no one's birthday or anniversary. They were simply celebrating being together, being healthy, being blessed. As the evening wore on and the younger grandchildren were put to bed, the adults gathered around a bonfire. Stories were told, jokes were shared, and laughter filled the air. At one point, James raised his glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, "who taught us that love and hard work can build anything. That family is the most important thing. That taking chances on the people you love is always worth it." Everyone raised their glasses, and Yates felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked at Miriam and found her looking back at him, her eyes shining with happy tears. Later, after everyone else had gone to their own homes or to bed, Yates and Miriam walked to the gazebo he'd built for their anniversary. They sat together on the bench, holding hands, looking out at the land they'd worked for nearly 3 decades. "I never get tired of this view," Miriam said softly. "Of this place, of this life." "Neither do I," Yates agreed. "It's home, real home, not just a place but a feeling." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't opened the door that night?" she asked. "Sometimes. But not often, because the alternative is too terrible to consider. I'd be alone. I'd have missed out on everything that makes life worth living. You, our children, our grandchildren. This family we've built. No, I try not to think about what might have been. I'm too grateful for what is." Miriam squeezed his hand. "I love you, Yates Xander. I've loved you for 28 years, and I'll love you for however many more we have." "I love you too, Miriam Xander. From that first night when you knocked on my door, soaking wet and terrified, to right now, with our family sleeping safely around us. You're still my everything. You always will be." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars wheeled overhead, just as they had thousands of nights before. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and one of the horses whinnied softly in response. It was perfect. It was home. It was everything they'd ever wanted and more than they'd ever dared to hope for. And it all started with a knock on the door during a storm, with a desperate young woman seeking shelter and a lonely cowboy who chose to let her in. Neither of them had known then that they were opening the door to the rest of their lives. That a simple act of kindness would lead to decades of love, partnership, and family. But that was the beauty of it, Yates thought as he held his wife close. Life's greatest gifts often come when you least expect them, when you're just trying to be a decent person and do the right thing. Open the door. Take the chance. Trust in love. Those simple decisions can change everything. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they finally stood to go inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight they had this. Each other, their family, their home, and the absolute certainty that they'd made the right choice all those years ago. Yates helped Miriam up from the bench, and together they walked back to the house they'd built, the life they'd created, the future they'd secured for their children and grandchildren. Hand in hand, step by step together, just as they'd always been, just as they'd always be. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night and sealing in the warmth and love of home. And if anyone had been there to see it, they would have witnessed what Yates and Miriam already knew in their souls. That true love, the kind that weathers storms and builds empires and creates legacies, begins with a simple choice. The choice to open your door when someone knocks, the choice to offer shelter when someone needs it, the choice to see the person instead of the circumstances. And the choice, made over and over again through the years, to love with your whole heart and build a life together that matters. That was their story. That was their legacy. And it was, in every way that counted, a story with a perfect, happy ending.